We will be recording this starting now, so really excited to be with you all here today. Thanks for the intro, Jen. And yes, there is a puppy in the house, but the puppy couldn't join because the puppy likes to eat everything, including headphones, keyboards, doorknobs, bed skirts, you name it. But maybe they'll make an appearance later. But yeah, I'm really excited to be with you all here today. Joined by some of my amazing teammates, like Jen introduced Trey, and of course the amazing Jen. And I think Jeff will be hopping on later. He's our resident nerd, and I can say that because I don't think he's on yet. Just teasing him. So a little bit about me, just really briefly. I embarked on this journey of regenerative organizations within Rhythm about 2.5 years ago, and since I joined, I've had the opportunity to just learn a ton about this work with our amazing team and clients and community from all over the world, like Jen said. And I know there's probably a lot of folks here in this room who have a lot to share on this topic and organizational development and just people's experience in organization as well. So one of our hopes for today is that this could be a super interactive webinar. Would love if you'd use the chat function, and at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. And just a bit about my background. I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but I grew up in Montreal, where I'm actually or north of Montreal, where I am right now with my parents for a few months. And, you know, when I was about 16 years old, I learned about climate change and the impacts that humans were having on the planet. And I sort of then and there decided that I wanted to dedicate my life to really healing humanity's relationship with the earth. And I couldn't have predicted that I would have ended up working in regenerative design. But, you know, what led me there was really the opportunity to work with organizations on some incredible teams worldwide working to solve complex issues like climate change, food security, bringing internet access to all. And what I really realized in the process is that we can't necessarily fix our ecological issues without really addressing our human issues, and that our ecological problems are really human problems as well. And so that's how I ultimately was led to in Rhythm. And Jen shared a little bit about us with you, and hopefully today you'll learn a little bit more about our approach. But just before we dive right in and jump into the content, I just wanted to acknowledge, you know, the times that we're in. I know many of us here are, probably all of us here are affected by COVID-19 in our own ways, and everyone's experiencing it differently. And I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. And it's just important to recognize the times that we're in and hold space for what emerges in that as well. So thank you all for being here. And with that, let's just dive in and talk about how we can regenerate potential in our organizations and our systems, because it's really needed now more than ever. Okay, so briefly, overall overview expectations. Today, we're going to look at the state of organizations today. We're going to talk about a new metaphor and in Rhythm's a design approach, and then also a discussion. But just before as we're diving into it, actually would love, some of you have already posted in the chat about where you're calling in from, but it would be awesome if you could just, for those of you who haven't had the chance yet, just let us know where you're calling in from. If you're here with an organization, feel free to let us know that. Just love to create some points of connection. Connection's a really important part of this work, and would love to be able to offer that to you all here today. And it's great to see some familiar faces, by the way, and lots of new ones as well. So, all right. So when you think about organizations and what they're designed after, what would you say is the dominant metaphor? So like, what do you think of, what images come to mind when you think about companies, organizations? Just drop in the chat what comes to mind for you. I'll just take a moment to pause, and maybe Jen will read out loud what people post.
Machine, hierarchical.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pyramid.
Yeah.
I would add focus on profit.
Yeah, and that
a
those
mess.
are all absolutely correct. And so
structure.
Why we focus on metaphors? Metaphors are really about the hidden assumptions and worldviews. Metaphors shape how we think, and they shape our worldview, and they can have influence on how we make decisions and how we design. They really, some people say that they create culture. And until we begin to recognize these hidden assumptions and hidden metaphors and what underlies those assumptions, any efforts that we create, that we attempt to create change, are really only scratching the surface, because there's all these hidden assumptions and metaphors underneath it. So a lot of you are very spot on the dominant metaphor across all sectors today is really the machine. So results from quick Google searches. On the left, we have an image of how to run your business as a machine with all the cogs fitting together, sales, production, services, and then profit coming out the other side. In the middle, it's an Inc. article. Inc. is a famous magazine, 5 ways to run your company like a well-oiled machine. And then on the right is from McKinsey. Many of you are probably familiar with that consulting firm, and they talk about creating a leadership factory, a continuous improvement engine. So this machine language and metaphor is really embedded in how we design and manage our organizations, and even how organizations are recommending others do it. But it doesn't just stop there. We even see entire states as machines. So this is an example here on the left of the state of Georgia, thinking about its economy as an engine. And again, the images of the cogs. And then on the right is is a little doodle image of our education system. So the prevailing system of management isn't just affecting organizations in the sense of the companies and nonprofits, but it's about economics. It's also about our education system. If you think about schools, I was listening to this podcast the other day from an amazing systems thinker, and he was talking about Peter Senge, and he was talking about the impact that the industrial and machine metaphor has had on schools. And all of us at some point in our lives have attended school in some form. And I think it's just really powerful to recognize that that metaphor is really in schools as well. And then we even think about our own human bodies as machines. On the right is an old image comparing different levies and pulleys to different human organs. And it's really try to think of the human body interchangeably with a machine. And in the middle here, how many of us use terms like burnt out? I need to reset. I need to recalibrate my brain. I need to rewire my operating system. We talk about burnout. We talk about how driven we are. This metaphor is everywhere. And even prominent business leaders like Ray Dalio, who is founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the world's largest hedge funds, one of his principles is to think about yourself as a machine operating within a machine, and know that you have the ability to alter your machines to produce better outcomes. So this metaphor is everywhere. The more you see it, the more you can't unsee it, because it's really in our language, and it's in the way that we design and manage all human social systems. But if we think about it, what are the consequences of treating organizations as machines and humans as part of a machine? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think the consequences are? Go ahead and type it in the chat. Think about the impact on people, planet, yeah. Environmental destruction, emphasis on control, distress, atrophy, yeah. All of those are consequences of the design, fragmentation, isolation, burnout, absolutely. So we at EnRhythm see this, if we think about this, the impacts of this design and this metaphor from a meta level, really the outcomes of running our machines as a whole, from governments to nonprofits, for-profit, is having a true impact on the living planet, like some of you called out. The Living Planet Index is just one way to measure that, to quantify that. And as we all know, humans are one of the greatest impacts on biological diversity, and it is in rapid decline. The machine metaphor hasn't been great for people either. Every year there's an organization in the United States called Gallup that does a study that looks at employee engagement, and people kind of self-assess whether they're disengaged or engaged. And for 2019, they found that only 36% of people are engaged at work. That means that about 65% are disengaged or actively disengaged. Imagine the lost potential, right? So the design is clearly not working for people, and it comes at a cost to our economy. Actively disengaged employees cost the US economy alone $450 billion to $550 billion lost productivity every year. That's crazy. And then just a shout out to the millennials and the impact on the future leaders in the workforce. I'm a millennial myself, and millennials have some of the lowest engagement rates of any group. Only 29% of millennials are engaged. And millennials make up 38% of the workforce right now. And some estimate that will make up as much as 75% of the workforce by 2025. So something has got to give in the design. Equality, from another lens to look at the impact of the machine metaphor, is really through the lens of equality. And so as a result of this design, individuals have net worths that are greater than entire countries. So the design is leading to the benefit of those at the top, those individuals at the top. And then through an equity lens, really from a racial and a gender equity perspective, the same system is creating a ton of inequity. We're seeing the pushback against this system very strongly in last year and this year, and really for many years now, especially in the United States. But still, race is the greatest predictor of how well someone will do with regards to jobs, housing, education, equitable development, particularly true here in the USA. And one more slide just to really hone in on this point on equity. This is a slide courtesy of our partners at the Gemini Group. And these little images that I'm going to show are actual Supreme Court cases, and they're policies that have led us to recognize here why in the United States, why we're in this racial situation. And it's because of the structures and the laws that have been designed. It is not by accident that there is inequity in our system. These are just a few examples of different Supreme Court case studies that have really led to a lot of the inequities that we are seeing today. And ironically, while the metaphors that we use build and shape our world, our language often lacks truthfulness. And I'm reading a book right now called by an author called Lean Gorison, Building the Future of Innovation. And I just love what Lean wrote. Centuries of human development have led to governments that can't govern, economies that can't economize, corporations that can't incorporate, schools that don't get the essence of learning, investments that don't leave the world better off, consumer goods that don't do good, and healthcare systems that don't care. So it's ironic to think that while metaphors are shaping and building the world that we live in, our language and the way that we choose to describe the things that we create are really not matching up. So at In Rhythm, we see this as a design issue. So on the one hand, it's really disheartening to think that we've designed our systems in this way, but at the same time, it's empowering. We can design to a new metaphor. We can make a decision to design in a new way. And so that's really what we're all about at In Rhythm. And Trey, who's on this call, often says, we've taken an industrial system and applied it to a living environment, and it's not working. So something has got to change. So of course, we see the limitations of designing with the machine metaphor in mind, but it's really important to recognize where it came from because it was actually originally a very empowering metaphor. The machine metaphor was actually born out of the industrial age, and it resulted in a huge shift towards a scientific, rational, reductionist worldview dominated by prediction, control, cause and effect. And the belief at the time was really that the world could be explained by reducing it to its parts, and that nature worked according to these mechanical laws. And people began to experience a lot of peace of mind because before that, there was really very few answers for things and a lot of questions. So this new paradigm really provided a lot of answers for people. And so people felt a sense of peace. But this approach that was originally around the scientific method began to be applied to phenomena in the social science and really all human endeavors. And so ultimately this became the kind of the underpinning of the foundation for much of our Western civilization. So that's just a little bit about where this machine metaphor came from and about the history. And it's been responsible for really tremendous advancements in our society. So it's very important to recognize that history. But even Einstein recognized the limitations of a reductionist approach in the 60s. So he wrote, this is a quote from him, when the number of factors coming into play in a phenomenological complex is too large, the scientific method in most cases fails. One only need think of the weather, in which case the prediction, even for a few days ahead, is impossible. So what we're realizing and what Einstein's calling out here is really that the machine approach doesn't work everywhere. When we're managing and dealing with complexity, we can't predict or control. And so here's a framework to think about that. Really what Einstein's pointing to is that there are complicated things and there are complex things, and complicated things need a very different management and design approach than complex things. But most often people don't understand the difference between the two of these. So we'll start with complicated. Complicated things have inputs. They have a series of steps that can lead to predictable outputs. complicated problems can be hard to solve, but they're addressable with rules and recipes. And that's really all about things that we make, right? So when I think of complicated things, I think of putting together a set of IKEA furniture, and this is an example that we use in our presentations a lot. But IKEA furniture can be really frustrating to put together. Oftentimes, I say it requires me to have at least a glass or two of wine to have the patience to do it. But I want that series of instructions to be able to get the predictable output of creating a table. Or Trey often uses the example of Legos for his kids when Jen and Trey's kids were growing up. Of course, you want that series of steps to be able to create that giant castle out of Lego. But when we think of complex systems, in contrast, complex systems are characterized by dense interdependencies. There's many actors involved. When change happens, it's nonlinear. There's a lot of unknowns. And we can't predict or control the outcomes of what's going to happen because it is so complex and there's so many moving parts. And so there's no series of instructions or best practices to follow. So what we find is that, again, complicated things are really about things that we make, and complex is really great for things that we manage. And the most significant challenge that we face today is that, like, the issues that we are facing, climate change, food security, managing organizations, they're really complex in nature, right? And we have a tendency as human beings, because of the metaphors that we have grown up with, that we have a huge long history with, have really trained us to take a complicated approach. And so, these two ways of thinking really require very different mindsets, different expectations, and different tolerances for ambiguity, right? So managing complexity, we need a new approach. And just to really hit this point home, when you look at these images, is this complex or complicated? Feel free to type into the chat. Complex or complicated? Complicated, yes. And these two, nature, an auditorium, what happens when one thing changes in one of these systems? Complex, absolutely. So there's a growing recognition across a variety of industries. These are a couple of images from healthcare, from schools. We're recognizing that our human systems are complex systems, and we need to learn how to manage complexity in new ways. So here at In Rhythm, we believe we are in the middle of another shift in perception. We don't feel like this is going to be known as the digital age or the Facebook age or the Twitter age or the millennial age, but it's going to be known as the age of complexity. And we are going to be known, our generations are going to be known by whether or not we have developed the ability and really figured out how to manage through these complex issues that we face, because it's happening at a scale and at a pace that has never happened before in human history. So we need new models in order to understand how complexity works and how to manage for it. Nature has about 3.8 billion years of experience, and living systems have these unique principles and characteristics that enable them to manage and work with complexity in ways that we currently design and manage our human systems in that machine way simply don't. So we often say, what can we learn from living systems? Well, if we're going to turn to life as a metaphor first, let's be really clear on what we mean by that. There's a lot of different perceptions of what life is. This is one example, the circle of life. And we all know that life in nature isn't all about rainbows and butterflies and warthogs and meerkats singing and dancing, and lions for that matter. But the world is really more based upon this idea of balancing predator and prey relationships. So there's a lot of different ways to view what living systems are. And so we believe that it's really important to be clear, and Rhythm's really spent a lot of time grounding our work in true living system science. So what has really helped to inform that is some amazing studies that have come out of a group of scientists located in Chile. They're called the Santiago School, and two main people in particular, Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. They really have been the first to take a holistic approach to this question of what is life, what is living systems, what do we really mean? Because, up until recently, the field of biology has actually had a really hard time coming to terms and defining in being in agreement on what a definition for life really is. We actually go into this in our foundations course, and it's really interesting to kind of begin to understand the complexity and really diving into what life means. But really briefly, what these scientists did is they took a cell and they recreated it in a test tube. And what they discovered is that they could completely recreate all the parts of the cell and what it looked like, but it lacked one core ability. In a test tube, it couldn't self-maintain. So when a cell's alive and all the pathways are interacting, it could self-maintain or self-regenerate. And so when you take a holistic approach, they really began to discover some new things that weren't previously able to be recognized by a more reductionist approach to this question. So the underpinnings of In Rhythm's approach are really based on the systems view of life, which is a book that's absolutely worth checking out if you're interested in nerding out on more of the science. And again, we go into this more in our foundations course. But what we designed to, this definition for us that came out of the Santiago school, is life is an organized system capable of self-maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. So regeneration is really a defining aspect of life. And so that's something we designed to. So how are we using this systems view of life? How are we using living systems to inform how we design and manage organizations? So in terms of what we've learned so far, let's just do a recap. So the machine design is used to engineer best practices, right? The business world, nonprofit world, it's all about what are the best practices that can be applied in one place, that are learned in one place that can be applied to another. So the machine design engineers best practices that really enforce prescriptive structures. This idea that what works here will work in another system. Just because it worked in one place, it will work in another. But unfortunately, what we see time and time again in social systems is that this approach degenerates the health of the system. We hear from clients all the time that this operating methodology that was supposed to work in all of these tech companies, well, it really didn't work in ours and actually caused a lot of frustration. So using prescriptive structures in social systems degenerates the health of the system. But on the contrast, if we start with a living systems design, living systems are what informs principles. So a principle-based approach, that's how we design with life in mind. And this allows for flexibility in design. And then principles facilitate the creation of tools and flexible frameworks that we use to manage complexity. And if we do this, this approach ultimately regenerates the health of the system, and it develops the ability to self-maintain and self-regenerate. In the machine design approach, it requires more energy to do this in social systems, and it requires more external outputs. Whereas in the living systems design and social systems, it actually takes less energy. And as I mentioned earlier, they develop the ability to self-maintain. And ultimately, we recognize that neither one of these approaches is necessarily inherently good or bad. It's simply a matter of the context in which we apply it, right? I wouldn't want to receive IKEA furniture with a set of principles and frameworks to put it together. That would be horribly frustrating. I definitely want best practices and prescriptive structures to put that IKEA furniture together. But when we're designing human systems, when we're designing social systems at In Rhythm, we believe that these are living. And so we need to take a living approach to it. But to do that, we also recognize that it requires pretty substantial shifts in our perspectives and operations. Think back to the slide where we looked at how embedded the machine metaphor is in all of our systems. We were all raised in school systems, at least for the most part, that really ingrain this machine approach and machine design in us. And so we need to shift our perspective, and we need to shift our operations as organizations. So what do we mean by principles? That can sound a little vague for people who might not be familiar with the idea of principles, but principles are really how we design and manage with life in mind. And they're informed by living systems. So In Rhythm has 6 core principles. Well, they're on 2 slides, so I'll shift to the next slide in a sec. But really brief overview of these. We have a great blog on it that goes into detail. Maybe Jen can find that and post it here a little bit later. But a little bit about In Rhythm's principles that we use as a means for design. We design with holism in mind. So we recognize that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts in a living system. Think of planet Earth. The whole is really truly greater than the sum of its parts. All the parts make up this incredible planet, and it's the same in human organizations as well. Our second principle we design to is interdependence, which is the inherent value of all relationships in a system. And so this is recognizing the complexity of our deep interdependence with, in the context of organizations, our clients, our suppliers, our partners, even our competitors. The next principle is uniqueness, and that's really recognizing the value and the possibility of individual genius. So we at Rhythm really hold this very true and dear to our hearts, is the recognition that each of us is truly unique, and we bring a unique genius to the work that we do in the world, and really all that we do in the world. And how do we design with that in mind within our organizations versus the traditional role-based kind of prescriptive assumptions that, you know, we can all fit into boxes like marketing managers or I don't know, operations this. And so really offering flexibility to design with the uniqueness of the person in mind. The next is evolutionary, which is about maintaining a dynamic balance with ever-changing environmental conditions. I think this principle holds true more than ever in light of everything that's been happening in the world. And so many organizations have had to evolve. And what does it look like to create an organization where evolution is a part of its overall design and culture? The next is nodal, decentralized and distributed. So not relying on centralized command and control structures, and really allowing for all members of a system to be resourced, empowered decision makers. So more of like a networked approach. And then finally, and in no particular order, developmental, which is about the growth and health of the members of a system. So it's about creating the conditions for all members in a team, in a system, to be able to grow and thrive in conjunction with the health of the overall system. Thank you, Trey, for sharing the principles blog. So even Buckminster Fuller, he recognized the power of designing with life-centered principles. He said, work with life-centered principles and the universe pitches in to help. Buckminster Fuller was an amazing person. If you haven't heard of him, his work is definitely worth checking out. He was an American architect, systems theorist, author, designer, all the things. And he has helped to really inform our work. So we've learned a little bit about principles. What do we mean by frameworks? I'm going to touch on this briefly. Well, actually, first, let's just recap here. So what happens when you apply principles to complicated systems? So think back to the example. What if you received some IKEA furniture in the mail with some principles? How would you feel? Too vague. Yeah, definitely vague. How would it feel though if when you're send back the furniture? You'd be frustrated, right? Very frustrated. And then what happens when we apply sets of instructions or best practices to complex systems? Right? Think about not understood. Yeah. What else? How would you feel? Too rigid, leaves out the important things, incomplete, stifled. Similarly, all those are great, and also frustrated, right? Many of us in our organizations over the years have felt a sense of frustration by the design of them. Ultimately, what it comes down to, the design and management. And so it really does lead to this sense of frustration. But I think the beauty in this is that there's a recognition that we need a new kind of framework to manage this kind of complexity. And so that's what Rhythm's all about. This is Rhythm's regenerative framework. This is a design framework, a process framework, and this is how we design and manage complexity in organizations. And I've been working with this framework for 2.5 years, and I've really found it to be relevant at many different levels. I use it and many of our clients and members of our community of practice use it in different ways as well. But just a couple of ways this is relevant before we dive into the details. I use it for my personal life, for my family, for my product development plan. I do a lot of our product development at Rhythm, planning for workshops, but really, so it's relevant in those kind of smaller levels, but also to design whole organizations or networks, or we've worked with communities internationally or cross-sector collaboratives. So it's really, for those of you who are kind of systems nerds here, it's very fractal and it's really relevant at many different scales. And it's super flexible. So it provides a lot of freedom in terms of how you can use it. And I won't go into it in too much depth because we spend a lot of time doing this in some of our online courses, and we really just want to give a quick overview today. But I'll go through each kind of core element of it in brief. So if we look at the context first, in any living system, at In Rhythm, we start by understanding the context, and that's comprised of the purpose, so really that deep why, the quality of life. That's a question that we don't ask ourselves enough when we're creating and designing organizations, is what kind of quality of life do we want to have when we are doing this work together? And I think oftentimes our work comes at the expense of our quality of life. So that's something that we very intentionally design. And we ask, how do I need to behave in order to ensure the support of those on my team? And then we look at the supporting environment. What are the systems that we're a part of, and how and what agreements do we need to have at those various levels? The next element that we look at that I think is really core to In Rhythm's work and really unique about In Rhythm's work is looking at the underlying health of the system. And in any living system, a healthy system has conditions that allow it to self-regenerate, like we've been talking about. And, for example, we often draw the parallel. Some of you here might be familiar with regenerative agriculture. And so when we create the conditions, when we create healthy soil, we then grow healthy plants, and that becomes healthy food for us to eat. And so in organizations, we spend a lot of time understanding and monitoring the health of the system in order to create the conditions for people to thrive, for them to be able to make intelligent decisions, for information to be able and communication to allow relevant exchange across all members of the system, and then to recognize that we need a diverse, supportive community in order to have underlying health. And structures, organizational structures, we spend a lot of time here with teams, organizations, and our clients. Structures are really first and foremost meant to support the underlying health of the system. Structures are things like roles and responsibilities, organizational design, meetings. How often do we design meetings just to get shit done, when really we should be designing meetings to enable a healthy system? So structures are something we spend a lot of time on, and we really think of them very differently than traditional kind of organizational design. And then next is work. Work is why we all come together in organizations. Many of us, when we're faced with an issue in an organization, we tend to navigate to, oh, we need to change our strategic plan, or we need to develop a new product or a program, or Slack will solve all our problems. But again, we tend to navigate back to, well, let's look at underlying health and understand what's truly going on in the system. So, of course, work is why we all come together, and the quality of work that we're really trying to cultivate is one where people are in roles where they are thriving and they're able to express their uniqueness through the work that they're doing. And then ultimately, if we can do all this, our aspiration is really, if we embrace emergence, if we embrace this emergent approach, and recognize that we are designing and managing complex systems, not complicated ones, we know that we can't predict or control what's going to happen. And so we recognize that unlimited potential will emerge, and resilience will emerge, and so will value and wealth creation. So that's just a little bit about In Rhythm's framework. We go into a ton of detail about this in our foundations course and in some of our design labs if you're interested in learning more. This just gives you a little bit of a taste of our approach. And so here, that leads to the regeneration of health, like I said. And then lastly, shifts in tension. So just kind of back to the slide here. As I was saying earlier, shifts in perspectives in operation is where we spend a lot of time with people and our clients. And we recognize that there's 6 key shifts. So we'll run through them. So we need a shift from best practices to principles, right? Allowing principles to guide evaluation and design, allowing solutions to be context specific rather than what works in one place will work in another. From prescriptions to responsive frameworks, so creating structures that are flexible, adaptable, and responsive to a changing environment. From dominance to interdependence, both within our organizations and between them. So it's moving from competition to true cooperation, recognition that we are interdependent beings. From prediction to patterns. So again, we can't predict and control what's going to happen in living systems, but we can look for the patterns. And so it's about creating the conditions for health and for emergence. From extraction to equity, so it's a shift. We're seeing people as the energy source of organizations, and it's about developing the whole versus developing the few. And lastly, from centralized power to decentralized empowerment, where intelligent and resource decision-making is occurring throughout the entire organization, not just the top, not just people at the top making those decisions and telling everybody else what to do. It's actually about allowing and creating the conditions for everyone to be empowered to make decisions and run with things. So this is our definition. It is a living, evolving definition of what a regenerative organization is. So our definition is a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. That is what our definition for a regenerative organization is. That gets me pretty excited. So a quote just from the amazing systems thinker, Donella Meadows. Some of you might be familiar with her work. It's also worth checking out. She said, "The world is a complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. We treat it as if it were not, as if it were divisible, separate, simple, and infinite. Our persistent, intractable global problems arise directly from this mismatch." I think that's a really powerful quote, just recognizing that our approach is really mismatched. And that's empowering too, because as you've learned in this webinar, we can design differently. So we'd love to just close before we go into Q&A. We have plenty of time for Q&A, and some of my amazing team members are here to join the discussion for those of you who want to stick around. But we'd like to open it up. Just what has shifted for you today? What's shifting for you? We recognize that shifts are essential. So would love to, I'll stop sharing my screen and just open it up. Jen, you there?
Okay, it looks like we have a question in the chat. How do you think about abundance different than productivity? I could see this being perceived as production, a more machine technical oriented mindset.
That's a great question. So this brings me back to kind of the metaphor of working on the land. And so in regenerative agriculture, when we think about abundance, it's really it's recognizing that productivity is a part of abundance, right? So we are able to produce outcomes in, say, a regenerative agriculture system that are crops, and have that abundance, but it goes beyond productivity, right? Abundance is about recognizing that, yeah, Joan says abundance isn't reductionist. That's an interesting way to put it too. Yeah, maybe Trey has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, one of the things to just consider is abundance. The beautiful thing about living system is abundance encompasses emergence, things that you would have never imagined that would have happened, and allowing for that, versus productivity is that direct relationship to what that machine can produce. It is a one-to-one relationship. When you build a machine, it's going to produce one thing and one thing well. It will not ever have anything that's emergent. Whereas in a living system, you will have that. So one of the things we often talk about in abundance is beginning to pay attention to the things that emerge as a part of the health within the system. And so abundance can be applied to the entire system, not just to productivity. So abundance in health, abundance in how we approach this interconnectedness across a boundary, so with other organizations or other partners. So there's an enormous amount of things that show up in abundance. And so, as Alex says, it's a part of productivity, is a part of it. And we want that to be seen as a part of a system, but it's more expansive and includes emergence.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about it is, think of a time where you've been a part of something larger than yourself. And oftentimes people have stories where something emerges that they never could have imagined. And so that's one way to really tangibly think about emergence, is when, a group of people comes together and something emerges that you never could have predicted.
I love the question. If you would if you would start an organization or a company from zero today, where do you start to make it regenerative from time zero?
That's a great question. I mean, where do you start from? I think it begins with conversation. So if you were to begin a company from ground zero, I would assume there would be people that you're involved with that are starting that with you, or maybe you're on your own. And so I think it starts with asking questions and recognizing that this approach requires all of us to really dive deep into the difficult questions of how do we do things differently, how do we take a living systems approach. And so yeah, just engaging in those conversations and having a learning mindset. And maybe Jen and Trey have some thoughts too.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the perfect things to do in design is start with the principles. So when you think about a startup, those 6 principles, what does a startup or a new organization look like in any particular area to be more holistic versus siloed? What does it look like to design it to be interconnected? So when we get into a design conversation, like Alex said, around these questions, it begins to open up possibilities versus we just go copy what our neighbor did that was an entrepreneur and he did it this way, so it should work for me this way. It is an engagement process to allow us to think about what would be unique to our context so that we can design accordingly. And then the last thing I'd say, one of the parts that I think we often don't design around is the people that are a part of it. So in Rhythm and a lot of organizations, we specifically design with the people in mind, the people who are a part of it, versus with thy product in mind. Because if we can create conditions for people to thrive, for it to be unique for them, then we believe that we can design all kinds of incredible things and products or services that we can bring into the world. But when we design around a product and service, then typically everything is in service to that. And in reality, we want to create an environment that allows people to thrive so that we can create even better emergence as a part of that. So 2 things, principles and the uniqueness of the people who are involved.
Yeah, and maybe also context. So when you had in Rhythm's regenerative framework slide up, really designing with the context first, with the people that you're working with. What is our deep why and our purpose? What is the quality of life that we want to have together during this work, and how do we need to behave? So really just putting intention into that really early on and getting crystal clear on what your context is as a team is another place to start. But love the principles idea, Trey.
I'll use my analogy about feeling like in the past I had to learn Italian before going to Italy. And that's not the right approach, or I'll probably never make it to Italy. I know Alessandra is Italian, but it's a process, and don't feel like you have to have it all figured out before you start that. So
I think that's a very good point, Jen. One of the things I've definitely struggled with in this is feeling like I need to have the whole living systems approach figured out and learn it all. But I think what's true for any one of us is that we're all on a learning journey, and you don't have to have it all figured out to start. And we'll learn as we go. And one of the things that we hold really true to our context is creating a nurturing community at In Rhythm and being a support to one another and providing tools to support people in that process too. So.
We have another question in the chat. How far do you take then the ecosystem principle when starting out? Do you stop with your staff, or do you extend to customers, suppliers, all value chain contributors?
Well, I would definitely say that when we think about in Rhythm's framework and we think about kind of the elements of health, if you think back to that slide, network connections, our customers, our suppliers, our partners are core to the health of our organizational system. And so we always encourage people to design and extend the regenerative principles out to those nested systems levels, because they're a very important part, and we are interdependent, right? We are in relationship with one another, and how can we begin to create the conditions for our whole ecosystem to be able to embrace that? But Trey, maybe you have any other thoughts?
That's spot on. And one of the things that we're encouraging in terms of just reimagining economies and finances, what does investment look like into the entire ecosystem versus just into an organization? So we can begin to recognize that because of that interconnectedness and that relatedness, you can't silo any of those things off. So we would want to ensure that our customers and suppliers are not being just fairly treated. They are a part of the abundance of the system. And if we don't design with them being a part of it, I think we're extracting from them for our benefit. And that is just as harmful as us doing it within the organization. So we've got to recognize that those systems are intimately a part of this design. And yes, it's tough, but we have got to ensure that we begin designing that way.
There's a great question and something maybe we can touch on or come back to about Charles Eisenstein. And that is in the chat. I don't know if we have time for that, but it seems like it's a really good thing to flesh out at some point.
Well, I'd be happy to jump into that. I know Charles. I've had many conversations. He's been a part of multiple engagements through a lot of our work and partnership with the Savory Institute. He's an incredible thinker. I can say specifically that that centralized economy has got to change. We can't reconcile. I use the analogy often of new wineskins, and it's kind of a metaphor of a first century, the way wine was made. And in the first century, when wine was made, you put new grapes in wineskins, and then it expanded so that you can drink wine. But you don't put new grapes in old wineskins, because that structure already adapted to a different context. And then what happens when you put new grapes into old wineskins, it bursts. So it ruins the wine and the wineskin. And so we see regeneration as new wine. You don't put it in old structures, an industrialized system. It doesn't work, and it won't work. I think there are ways for us to begin to build bridges, but it's about redesigning what we think economies are. And we'd encourage you to reach out. And there's a great white paper by John Fullerton at the Capital Institute, which is all about reimagining finance and economies through a regenerative lens. And we'd be happy to send you more information on that. But we have got to recognize that the growth, it needs to move from productivity as the measure and efficiency as a measure to health as a measure. In a living system, health is the underlying measure that we should be paying attention to. And the rest is an emergent outcome of that underlying health. And until we embrace that kind of mindset, we're going to continue to be burdened by trying to create efficiency and productivity for that sake alone.
Actually, that's a great point, Trey. Joan, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Joan was asking, is health the main point of monitoring, similar to ecosystem processes and holistic management?
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, what we recognize is if we can create the conditions for health, then we believe outcomes will just be recurring and naturally a part of the system. But when we focus our design around productivity and efficiency, it's usually at the expense of health. And we've all experienced it, where we were forced to try to create productivity within any system, and then we suffered in a social system. In agricultural systems, you see the same thing. We know how to create productivity and efficiency by using more and more inputs. But then when you look at the underlying health of the soil, it's not there. And so the health of the soil was sacrificed for productivity's sake. And we see that in living systems around the world. So what does it look like for us to flip that and then begin to design with health in mind as a means to create the conditions for the outcomes that we all want?
Great. Okay, I think we're winding up. I just want to say thank you again. And Alex and Trey, if you have anything else to add, but we really appreciate your time. And we'd love to see you back with us on another webinar. Actually, in 2 weeks from today, the same time slot, we're having a design sprint, and I can put that link in the chat. But it's a way that we'll have a guest speaker on, and we'll be going through the regenerative framework. And so kind of fleshing out the details of that. If you're interested in that framework slide, we'll be doing that on a very practical level. So I will drop that in the chat as well. And then love to talk with you guys about any things coming up or online courses or other webinars. So feel free to email me or get in touch with us through info@inrhythm.co.
Thank you all. We're really grateful to have spent this time with you, and thank you for choosing to spend your time with us learning about this and engaging in conversation. It gives us a lot of energy. And as Jen said, if there's anything we can do to support you on your journey, just get in touch, and we'll send a follow-up with the recording in case you want to share this out with anyone, and the slides too. So thank you, Jen, thank you, Trey, for being here, and thank you all too.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a great day or evening wherever you're located. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, Yvonne.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Pillars.
Bye. So nice to meet you. Bye, Jen.
Great job, everybody.